The night air over Rome feels thick and alive as you ascend the marble staircase of the Palatine Hill toward the heart of power. Torches flicker against towering columns, their light trembling on bronze helmets that never turn to meet your gaze. Every step echoes between the walls like a warning. In your hand glitters a golden invitation, its seal bearing the mark of the emperor himself. It should be the highest honor of your life, yet your stomach twists as if it senses the danger hidden beneath the perfume of incense that drifts through the courtyard. Behind those grand doors lies the palace of Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, the man the people once adored and now whisper about in fear. To the crowds, he is Caligula, the little soldier who grew into the master of Rome, but among senators, his name carries the chill of uncertainty. You enter the great hall where marble gleams like ice under 100 oil lamps. The elite of the empire stand in uneasy silence, their jeweled hands clutching goblets they dare not raise. The air hums with restrained terror. Then comes the sound that freezes every soul in place, the quick rhythm of approaching footsteps, followed by laughter that does not sound human. The doors open, and the emperor steps through, his robe blazing like molten sunlight, his expression unreadable. His eyes move across the assembly with a strange delight, the gaze of a man who knows that every person before him exists only by his permission. He smiles, and even that simple gesture feels like a test. You bow with the others, heart pounding, praying not to be noticed. Caligula's voice rings out, smooth and melodic, welcoming his loyal friends to an evening of celebration. The words sound generous, but everyone senses the threat beneath them. Servants glide forward with trays of wine, yet no one drinks first. The emperor raises his cup, and the hall erupts in a chorus of forced laughter. In that moment you realize that Rome's grandest palace has become a theater, and the audience and actors are one and the same. Every gesture is watched, every word weighed. The walls seem to listen. The scent of roses mixes with the heat of fear until it becomes suffocating. Somewhere outside, the city sleeps unaware that its ruler now treats power as a game of humiliation. You see senators exchange nervous glances, each man calculating how much loyalty he must display to survive the night. The emperor walks among them, trailing silence behind him, stopping at random to praise or mock. When he laughs, the entire room trembles with imitation laughter, the perfect echo of obedience. You feel the pulse in your throat as if the empire itself beats inside your chest. This is not the Rome of your ancestors, but something darker, a world where virtue has been replaced by performance and every smile hides dread. The music swells, the laughter continues, and above it all rings the sound of absolute power disguised as joy. He was born in the 12th year of the Common Era, a child of promise in a family adored by the legions and envied by the Senate. His father was Germanicus, Rome's shining general, the man who brought glory from distant frontiers, and was hailed as the heir to everything noble in the empire. His mother was Agrippina the Elder, proud, intelligent, and fiercely loyal. Into this world of triumph and expectation came a small boy who followed his father's troops on campaign, dressed in a miniature soldier's uniform that made hardened legionaries laugh with affection. They called him Caligula, the Little Boot, a nickname that clung to him long after childhood. But behind the smiles and the shining armor lurked danger. Germanicus died suddenly in the east, poisoned, some whispered, by agents of Emperor Tiberius. The joyous marches turned into processions of mourning. The empire's favorite family became its most watched and its most cursed. Caligula, barely more than a child, saw his mother defy the emperor and pay the price. She was exiled, her sons imprisoned or killed one by one. The boy who had once ridden beside cheering soldiers learned instead to stay silent, to smile when he wished to scream. His home became a series of guarded villas where every servant might be a spy and every friend a betrayer. By the time he reached his teens, he understood that survival in the imperial house demanded perfect acting. He practiced obedience until it became his armor, bowing before the men who had destroyed his family, learning to conceal hatred behind courtesy. The Romans liked to tell themselves that their rulers were chosen by fate, But for young Caligula, fate was a monster that devoured those he loved. He watched power from below, not as a privilege, but as a weapon. While other boys learned to speak with honor, he learned when to remain silent. Each tragedy carved something out of him until little remained but a hollow space where fear and ambition mixed. The soldiers still remembered the charming child in tiny boots, but that child was gone, replaced by a young man who had seen what gods looked like when they fell. To the world, he appeared calm and well-mannered, a model of imperial virtue, yet beneath that surface, something had already begun to twist. He carried within him the lesson Rome had taught too well, that mercy is weakness, and that in the palace of the Caesars, trust is merely the first step toward death. On the rocky island of Capri, far from the bustle of Rome, the young Caligula spent his most impressionable years in the shadow of Emperor Tiberius. The sea around the island sparkled like glass, but within the emperor's villa, the air was heavy with decay and suspicion. Tiberius, old and withdrawn, ruled not through affection, but through terror. Whispers spoke of secret executions, of servants disappearing overnight, of courtiers forced to smile while watching others bleed. In that quiet labyrinth of marble corridors, Caligula learned that survival was an art. He had already lost his parents and brothers to imperial paranoia. Now he lived face to face with it. Each day began with ceremony and ended in silence. The boy who once laughed with soldiers now measured every breath, every gesture, every glance. Tiberius watched him carefully, uncertain whether this heir of Germanicus would become a threat or a useful mask. The emperor admired obedience above all, and Caligula gave it perfectly. He listened, nodded, and hid his disgust behind flawless courtesy. He discovered that the surest way to stay alive was to become invisible in plain sight. The palace on Capri was not merely a home, but a stage where fear rehearsed its plays. Senators came to flatter, poets to praise, and informers to whisper into the emperor's ear. Caligula absorbed everything, every cruel joke, every trembling plea. He saw that power did not require love. It required the illusion of control. He watched men humiliate themselves to survive another day, and in their degradation, he glimpsed the machinery of empire. No philosopher could have taught him more effectively what absolute authority meant. By night, the island echoed with laughter and cries that were not of joy. Caligula lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he would live to see the morning. Yet even in that darkness, something cold and determined grew inside him. He began to understand that emotions were dangerous, compassion fatal. When he looked at Tiberius, he did not see a monster, but a mirror of what power demanded. The emperor's cruelty was his armor, his isolation, his crown. Caligula studied it all like a student preparing for an examination he could not fail. In the evenings, he would walk along the cliffs and look toward the horizon where Rome lay, unseen beyond the sea, the city that would one day call him ruler. Perhaps he already knew that to survive there, he must become something more than human and less than merciful. The island of Capri taught him that in the empire of fear, the only safety lies in mastering terror itself. When the old emperor Tiberius finally died, Rome erupted in celebration as if a long nightmare had ended. The city that had lived too long under suspicion and silence suddenly exhaled. Bells rang, torches burned, and the streets filled with crowds shouting the name of the new ruler. They did not call him Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. They called him Caligula, the little soldier they remembered from the days of his beloved father. To the people, he was the child of Germanicus, returned to restore dignity and joy to the empire. When he entered the city in triumph, flowers rained from the balconies and soldiers wept openly. Senators rushed to pledge loyalty, relieved to see a young face in place of Tiberius's ghostly stare. In those first months, Caligula seemed to embody everything Rome wanted to believe about itself. He freed political prisoners, recalled exiles, lowered taxes, and staged magnificent games that dazzled the crowds. His generosity appeared boundless. He distributed gifts to the people, addressed the Senate with humility, and honored the memory of his family. For a brief moment, Rome felt reborn. The empire, weary of fear, looked upon its new prince as a godsend. Poets wrote verses comparing him to the dawn after a storm. Even hardened generals spoke of him with affection. Yet beneath the cheers, there lingered the faint unease that always accompanies power. Caligula's smiles were bright, but sometimes his eyes seemed distant, as if watching another world. He worked tirelessly, but his energy had a strange edge, a restlessness that no praise could satisfy. Those close to him noticed his fascination with symbols of divinity, the way he paused before statues of gods as though measuring himself against them. Still, no one dared to question him. After years of repression, any change felt like hope, and hope makes men blind. The Senate competed to please him, the people adored him, and the Praetorian Guard guarded him as if he were sacred. Rome had its young hero, handsome, eloquent, and merciful. No one wished to remember that absolute power, once given, never remains gentle for long. For 7 months the empire lived in a dream, believing that the blood of Germanicus would heal the wounds of tyranny. In every corner of the city, people whispered that the age of terror was over. They did not yet know that this joy was only the first act of another tragedy, and that behind the golden laurel crown already waited the shadow of madness. It began with a fever that burned for days and nights, a sickness so fierce that the city of Rome seemed to hold its breath. The emperor lay motionless in his chamber, attended by priests and physicians who could only whisper prayers. Crowds gathered outside the palace, weeping and begging the gods to spare the man they adored. When word spread that he had recovered, the city erupted in celebration, but those closest to him saw that something essential had not returned. Caligula rose from his bed, a changed man. The softness in his face hardened, and his laughter carried a new sound, sharp and cruel. Gratitude turned into suspicion. He began to speak of betrayal, of plots in the Senate, of omens in the sky. Those who had cared for him during his illness found themselves questioned and dismissed. Servants avoided his eyes. The young ruler who had promised mercy now spoke of power with fascination, as though his illness had stripped away the thin film of humanity that once restrained him. He told his courtiers that he had looked upon death and found it wanting, that the gods themselves had yielded to his will. From that moment, he no longer believed in limits. Money poured from the treasury to fund spectacles of impossible grandeur. He summoned poets to sing of his divine recovery, architects to build monuments that scraped the heavens, sculptors to carve his likeness beside Jupiter. When senators hesitated at the cost, he smiled and ordered new taxes, new confiscations, new punishments. He was alive, and Rome would pay tribute to that miracle. Yet behind the splendor grew something darker. His gaze lingered too long on those who bowed before him, as if testing the sincerity of their devotion. He delighted in seeing fear replace love. It proved his control. At feasts, he began to toy with his guests, asking questions that were traps disguised as compliments. One evening, he looked upon a senator and asked if the man still prayed to the gods for his emperor's health. The senator answered yes, trembling, and Caligula laughed, declaring that prayers were no longer needed, for he was the god who answered them. The courtiers laughed too, though no one truly dared. The fever had passed, but the madness it awakened would not sleep again. Rome had wished for a savior and had received one who believed himself immortal. The illness had given him a vision of power beyond flesh, and he intended to make the empire see it too. The Rome that Caligula ruled after his recovery became a city of constant performance, a living stage where the emperor played every role and demanded that all others serve as his audience. The games he once gave for the joy of the people grew in size and extravagance until they seemed endless, not celebrations, but declarations of dominance. He filled the arenas with exotic beasts, gilded chariots, and entire fleets that floated upon artificial lakes built at staggering cost. Senators and generals were ordered to attend, not as guests, but as props in the grand theater of imperial power. Every cheer for the emperor was rehearsed, every smile rehearsed again. He built new temples, renamed months after himself, and adorned the city with statues that showed his face, where once stood the images of gods. At night, the palace blazed with torchlight as feasts turned into pageants, each designed to remind the guests that nothing in Rome existed outside his will. The emperor's voice echoed through the marble halls as he improvised speeches that mixed philosophy, mockery, and command. He compared himself to Jupiter and Apollo, claiming he alone brought light to the world. To his admirers, he was divine. To his enemies, he was a nightmare made flesh. Yet even those who hated him applauded, for silence in his presence was an invitation to die. The line between politics and theater disappeared. Decisions were made not in the Senate, but in the dining room, between courses of gold-painted dishes. Soldiers and nobles were forced to compete for his amusement, poets to compose verses praising his wisdom, musicians to invent hymns in his honor. Those who failed to entertain him vanished without trace. Caligula discovered that terror was the most obedient audience of all. The city that once revered discipline now worshipped spectacle, and the emperor stood at its center like a conductor of chaos. He seemed to feed on the fear he created, watching faces carefully as he joked about executions and smiled when laughter wavered. Rome itself had become a mirror of his moods, jubilant in the morning, trembling by night. The empire's wealth drained away in games and monuments, but Caligula spoke of glory, insisting that the gods demanded it. When courtiers whispered about the cost, he reminded them that what was divine could never be expensive enough. Under his rule, entertainment replaced order, ceremony replaced justice, and every act of cruelty was disguised as art. In the glare of endless festivals, the young emperor's madness no longer hid in shadows. It danced in public, applauded by a city too terrified to stop clapping. Rumors began to move through Rome like smoke from a hidden fire, twisting from whisper to whisper, until they grew into stories that made even the boldest men pale. Inside the imperial palace, it was said, night had replaced day, and pleasure had replaced law. Servants claimed that Caligula wandered the corridors sleepless, choosing companions for his amusement, not by desire, but by whim. Senators' wives and daughters were summoned under pretexts of loyalty and dismissed in tears, their families silenced by fear. The emperor, who once rewarded devotion, now tested it with humiliation. Some tales told of feasts where guests were forced to applaud obscenities, others of chambers filled with mirrors so that every act could witness itself. Whether true or exaggerated, these accounts spread until the distinction between fact and rumor dissolved. The palace became a myth while its ruler turned into a monster, both feared and fascinating. Caligula seemed to understand this transformation and encouraged it, weaving his reputation into the fabric of power. If they already thought him capable of anything, then nothing could surprise them, and nothing could stop him. His cruelty grew theatrical. He delighted in seeing nobles shrink before him. He treated the pain of others as proof of his divinity, declaring that gods too created and destroyed for their pleasure. The city watched in horror as the emperor confiscated fortunes, punished mockery with death, and forced Rome's proudest families to serve his fantasies. He taxed prostitution, then turned rumor itself into a weapon, hinting that within his palace, a brothel staffed by women of rank awaited his guests. No one could prove it, but denial sounded as dangerous as confession. Thus, he ruled through stories, transforming fear into spectacle. The Senate cowered, the people murmured, and the Praetorian Guard obeyed without question. In the marble corridors once meant for governance, laughter echoed at strange hours, followed by silence too deep to question. Those who entered the palace too often learned to speak carefully, for Caligula's jest might become a command. He no longer needed laws, he needed only imagination. By night, torches flickered against frescoes that depicted myths of gods who loved and punished mortals, and it was said the emperor lingered before them, smiling at the resemblance. Rome itself had become his stage, and its citizens his unwilling actors. Every scandal fed his legend, every silence confirmed it. In that web of fear and fascination, reality dissolved, leaving only the image of a man who believed that to control others completely, one must first make them doubt what is real. The moment Caligula declared himself divine, Rome crossed a threshold from tyranny into something far stranger. The young emperor no longer sought to rule men, he sought to stand among the gods. He ordered temples built in his honor and placed his own statues beside those of Jupiter and Mars. He demanded that sacrifices once meant for the immortals now include his name, and priests bowed before his image with trembling hands. In the Senate, he sat upon a golden throne, addressing the senators as if they were lesser deities invited to serve him. His voice filled the chamber with the calm certainty of revelation. He spoke not as a man explaining belief, but as a god reminding mortals of their duty. When storms struck the city, he announced that nature obeyed him. When lightning split the sky, he laughed and claimed that Jupiter saluted his son. Courtiers praised his wit, their smiles stretched thin as blades. He renamed months after himself, dressed in the robes of Venus and Mercury, and performed sacred rites as though the pantheon had merged into one being, him. The people of Rome, who had endured many kinds of rulers, had never faced a god who demanded applause. He built an altar in his palace and declared it the temple of the living Caesar. There, he accepted offerings, often from men who had once mocked him, now desperate to prove devotion. He even ordered his image sent to the great temple in Jerusalem, commanding that it stand in the Holy of Holies. The idea that his likeness might occupy a place forbidden to all humans shocked even his loyal advisors, yet none dared to stop him. The empire trembled on the edge of sacrilege. Caligula seemed to delight in the outrage. It confirmed his power to reshape the world in his image. At festivals, he appeared dressed as a god and addressed the crowd as worshippers, asking if they believed in him. No answer was safe except praise. Some whispered that the emperor had gone mad, but madness was no longer a diagnosis. It was law. Rome's faith, once built on tradition, had been replaced by obedience. The sacred and the profane were now one, bound together in the person of a man who believed eternity itself should kneel. Beneath the marble domes of his temples, incense curled upward like prayers to an empty sky, and the people who had made him divine wondered whether the gods they had displaced still listened. When Caligula turned his attention to war, the legions of Rome expected conquest. Trumpets sounded, banners rose, and the emperor announced a glorious campaign across the northern seas. He spoke of victory, of destiny, of expanding the borders of the empire beyond the edge of the known world. Soldiers cheered, believing they would march into legend. Yet what followed was not war, but theater. Caligula led his army to the shores of Gaul, then to the coast facing the misty island of Britain, where Caesar himself had once dreamed of invasion. Camps were built, sacrifices made, and orders given with solemn precision. The legions stood ready for battle, but no enemy appeared. Instead, the emperor climbed a platform overlooking the sea and proclaimed that Neptune, the god of the ocean, was the true foe. At his command, soldiers drew their swords and struck the waves as if fighting an invisible army. He praised their bravery, rewarded them for victory, and ordered them to collect seashells as trophies of conquest. Chests filled with shells were paraded back to Rome, displayed as the spoils of a divine campaign. To the soldiers, it was madness. To Caligula, it was proof that even the sea obeyed him. When officers hesitated to celebrate, he accused them of treason. The legions, trained for discipline, could only follow his absurd commands, for in Rome's empire, obedience was survival. Upon returning to the city, he held a triumphal procession through the streets, riding in a chariot gilded with pearls, his soldiers trailing behind carrying the sacred spoils of the ocean. Trumpets blared, crowds watched in stunned silence, and the emperor smiled as if unveiling a great cosmic joke that only he understood. Some whispered that the campaign was not folly but a test, a way to see who would laugh and who would protest. Those who did not cheer loudly enough soon disappeared from public life. The campaign against Neptune became legend, a symbol of an empire ruled by illusion. Caligula's Rome no longer fought for territory or honor. It fought for the emperor's imagination. Power had become performance, and reason was the only casualty. Yet within the absurdity lay a terrible truth. An empire will accept any command, no matter how senseless, once it has learned that questioning power is more dangerous than obeying madness. The soldiers returned to their barracks, haunted not by battle but by laughter, and the seashells of Gaul became relics of a victory over reality itself. By the 4th year of his reign, The fear Caligula inspired had begun to consume even those sworn to protect him. The Praetorian Guard, once his shield, now served him with eyes lowered and hands trembling on their swords. Senators plotted in whispers, nobles feigned illness to avoid invitations to the palace, and Rome itself seemed to breathe in silence. Each day brought a new decree, each more unpredictable than the last. He punished men for imaginary crimes, seized fortunes to fund new monuments, and laughed at executions as if they were comedies written for his amusement. The cruelty had become casual, the madness systematic. Within the guard was a veteran named Cassius Chaerea, a man Caligula mocked relentlessly, calling him weak and ridiculing his voice before the court. The insults festered until hatred replaced duty. Around him, others shared that hatred, officers humiliated, nobles stripped of dignity, servants who had seen too much. The conspiracy formed in fragments, bound together not by ideology but by exhaustion. They decided that the emperor who believed himself immortal would die as a man. On a January afternoon in the 41st year of the Common Era, Caligula left the theater within his palace, still laughing from a performance that celebrated his divinity. He was escorted through a narrow corridor beneath the arena, where shadows hid the faces of men waiting for him. As he passed, Chaerea stepped forward, saluted, and struck. The first blow shocked the emperor more than it hurt him. Disbelief froze his features. Then, the others joined in, swords flashing in the half-light. The laughter that had filled Rome for years ended in a flurry of steel and shouts. When it was over, the body that once claimed to be a god lay motionless in the dust, stripped of its power, its voice, its myth. Outside, the city continued unaware, the people still living under the illusion that their ruler was untouchable. Only hours later did the news spread like wildfire, bringing not relief, but confusion. No one dared to celebrate. The Senate argued whether to restore the Republic or crown another Caesar, while the Praetorians searched the palace for the emperor's family, killing his wife and child in their frenzy. Power had devoured its master and now sought another to serve. In the blood-stained corridors of the Palatine, Rome learned again the oldest lesson of empire. That tyranny ends not in justice, but in another beginning, written with the same trembling hands that once applauded it. When the echo of blades faded and Caligula's body lay still, Rome entered a strange silence, the kind that follows a thunderstorm when the air feels heavy and unreal. The senators emerged from hiding, pale and shaken, whispering that the nightmare had ended. Yet the palace still smelled of blood, and the empire that had worshipped a living god now stared into the emptiness he left behind. In the confusion that followed, the Praetorian Guard, drunk on the power of their deed, roamed the corridors searching for survivors. They found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, trembling behind a curtain, a man long mocked for his limp and his stutter. The soldiers lifted him up, hailed him emperor, and the frightened scholar became ruler of the greatest empire on earth. The Senate protested, but the blades of the guard settled the debate. A new Caesar reigned before the old one's body was cold. Inside the palace, servants scrubbed the marble floors until no stain remained, while architects sealed off rooms where the most terrible acts had taken place. Statues of Caligula were toppled, inscriptions erased, portraits destroyed. Rome tried to forget him quickly, as if memory itself were dangerous. Public decrees called for calm and stability, promising that the madness was over. But beneath the surface, fear endured. Those who had profited under Caligula now swore they had always despised him. Those who had suffered stayed silent, unwilling to speak names that could still condemn them. The city returned to its rituals, its games, its daily routines, yet something essential had shifted. The people no longer looked at emperors as men, but as forces of nature, unpredictable and beyond understanding. Claudius restored order, reopened the treasury, and proclaimed amnesty. But the laughter of his nephew still haunted the halls of power. In private, senators confessed that they feared the return of another god in human form, yet none dared to weaken imperial authority, for chaos seemed worse than tyranny. Thus, the empire healed itself by forgetting. The crimes of Caligula were buried not out of mercy, but out of necessity. Rome preferred silence to truth, pretending that what had happened was an aberration rather than a mirror. The marble gleamed once more, the the festivals resumed, and the same voices that had cheered for the living God now cheered for the scholar emperor. In that uneasy peace lay the seed of every future despot, the belief that if the memory of horror is erased, its cause will never return. History tried to bury him, yet the shadow of Caligula refused to fade. In the decades that followed, his name became a whisper for everything Rome feared about itself. Historians wrote of him in careful tones, balancing outrage with restraint, transforming the man into a symbol of what happens when power escapes the bounds of reason. Some painted him as a monster, born of divine punishment, others as a victim of the empire's sickness, the mirror in which Rome saw its own corruption. The stories multiplied, of cruelty, of madness, of orgies and blasphemy, each retold until truth dissolved into legend. Yet behind the exaggerations lies a darker truth. Caligula was not an accident, but the natural child of a system that worshipped authority more than humanity. He merely stripped away the masks that others wore. The senators who feared him had once applauded Tiberius. The soldiers who killed him had enforced his will. The citizens who cursed him had once shouted his name in joy. His reign lasted less than 4 years, yet the scar it left ran through generations. Later emperors learned to hide their excesses more cleverly, to dress their tyranny in law and tradition, but the pattern remained. The empire discovered that cruelty could survive so long as it called itself order. Even centuries later, philosophers and playwrights invoked Caligula to explore the boundaries of freedom and the seduction of absolute command. His ghost walked through literature and history, warning that madness and power are twin reflections of the same hunger. The ruins of his palace still stand on the Palatine Hill, sunlit and silent, visited by tourists who see only stones and arches. They do not hear the echoes, the laughter, the cries, the applause that once filled those halls. Yet, the lesson endures. Civilization is never farther from chaos than the whim of one ruler. Every empire, every government, every institution carries within it the potential to repeat his story, for the desire to control others is as old as humanity itself. Caligula's fall did not end the age of gods in human form. It simply taught the next generation to pretend that their divinity was duty. His legacy is not in the ruins he left, but in the warning he became, that the greatest danger to any world lies not in its monsters, but in how easily it forgives them once they are gone.